Hey everybody, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 4 to take a look at another premium ship in World of Warships Legends. This time we'll be talking about the Tier 6 premium Japanese destroyer, Yukikaze. For this review, we'll start with some history, move into analysis, run down the stats with you, and finish off with some gameplay. If you do want to skip around it all though, you should see some time codes down in the description. The Kagero class destroyers were one of the largest runs of Japanese destroyers, initially intended to have 22 ships in total. 3 were cancelled though, and their incomplete hulls used as target ships by the Yamato. They did not survive. The ship we'll be talking about today is one of the remaining 19 that were completed. Laid down in August 1938, launched in March of 1939, and commissioned into service in January 1940, Yukikaze was the 8th ship of the Kagero class. The Yukikaze's first military forays were into the South Pacific, acting as an escort as part of Destroyer Squadron 16 and the invasion of the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, more familiar in today's terms as Indonesia. Though present at the Battle of Java Sea and having engaged Allied ships with torpedo spreads, there's no indication that she hit anything with those particular fish. But she is credited with rescuing around 40 Allied sailors from the water, though my sense is rescue may be a bit of an overstatement for Japanese prisoners of war. Following capture of most of the territory in the South Pacific, north of Australia, the 16th Destroyer Squadron joined the 2nd Fleet to escort it to Midway, and escort quite a bit less of it back to Japan. She then found herself at the Battle of the Solomon Sea and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Here she engaged in desperate close quarters naval combat that saw the US Navy lose the Atlanta and Juno. Sources do vary, and it's probably impossible to tell exactly what happened in the blind knife fight that occurred there, but certain Japanese sources at least give her credit for helping to sink one of the US light cruisers there, alongside her sister ships. Though that would have been quite a feat, she'd returned to escort the battleship Hiei, only to witness her being bombed into the sea. Escort duty then quickly gave way to rescue parts of the Hiei's crew. Early 1943 saw the 16th Destroyer Squadron making transport runs to the Solomon Islands. During this time, the squadron saw itself whittled away bit by bit, with only the Yukikaze making it through its time servicing the Tokyo Express without damage. Eventually, losses here became so bad that the Yukikaze was the only ship remaining operational in 16th Destroyer Squadrons, and so it would be transferred to the 17th. She was present at the Battle of Philippine Sea as escort to transport ships, and more notably at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she was part of the destroyer escort for the Japanese center force organized around the battleship Yamato. In this capacity, she partook in the Battle of Samar, assisting in the sinking of destroyers and escorts, protecting Taffy 3. It was even said to have passed by the life raft carrying the seriously wounded Commander Ernest E. Evans of the USS Johnston. The commander of the Yukikaze had his crew hold their fire, as unfortunately at this point during the Pacific War, shooting survivors was fairly common, and the Japanese commander, Masamichi Terauchi, saluted the crew of the stricken destroyer for their valiant fight, with Evans having been said to return their salute. With the damage done at the Battle of Samar, she attempted rescue operations, including to the badly damaged Suzuya, which I think we'll be talking about next week, though the cruiser exploded before she could render aid. Following the Battle of Samar, the Japanese fleet retreated back towards Japanese waters. The crew of the Yukikaze would have been able to observe the US Navy aviators striking Musashi again and again, until her speed fell so low that she was left behind with an escort, eventually to succumb to her wounds. Yukikaze was sent immediately to Yokosuka to form the escort for the converted Yamato-class battleship turned aircraft carrier Shinano. Unfortunately for the Shinano and her escorts, their zigzag pattern had them navigating directly into the path of the USS Archerfish. Though it's not clear if the Yukikaze was the destroyer that passed right over the Balao-class submarine without detecting it, it would take part in the effort to avenge the Shinano, as the Archerfish was able to land 4 torpedo strikes against the carrier, dooming it to the bottom just over 9 hours into its operational service. Having all but witnessed the sinking of the second Yamato-class battleship and being an inattentive shepherd for the third turned carrier, it might have seemed somewhat inauspicious when Yukikaze was made part of the escort for the Yamato herself during Operation Tengo. The plan was to drive the Yamato up on the beach at Okinawa and fight to the last shell and then to the last man. The Yamato, Yahagi, and her escort destroyers would never make it to their destination, though. Assailed by more than 400 American aircraft, the cruiser was sunk, and the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was also sent to the bottom. Yukikaze was also hit. She suffered only 3 dead and 15 wounded, though, and her good luck would hold out for the remainder of that battle, as a torpedo passed directly beneath her, which could have easily destroyed the ship, and a bomb landed inside her food pantry, but failed to explode. Though the captain of the Yukikaze wanted to continue the suicidal mission to reach Okinawa, she was ordered to attempt rescue efforts instead and return to Japan. She would pluck around 325 officers and enlisted from the waters before rescue attempts were called off at nightfall, when American subs would have posed a more deadly threat. After Operation Tengo, the 17th Destroyer Squadron was dissolved due to losses. Yukikaze was transferred briefly to the 31st Squadron, but the war was just about over, and the Yukikaze was about to go on a much larger transfer of sorts. On December 30th, 1946, control of the ship was handed over to the Allies. She was awarded to the Republic of China and renamed the Tangyan. She would continue to serve Free China during the brutal Communist Revolt and afterward until 1969, when she was finally decommissioned. There were talks of selling the ship back to Japan based on her history, but unfortunately her luck had run out when she was badly damaged by a typhoon and had to be sold for scrap, with only pieces of the ship, such as her propeller and the ship's wheel, returned to Japan to commemorate her service there. As far as the Yukikaze in-game, this is another Japanese torpedo boat, and it plays pretty much like every other Japanese torpedo boat. Lower your sea detectability, launch torpedoes at ships from stealth, and try not to get into any fair gunfights. And as far as Japanese torpedo boats go, she has pretty predictable strengths, and wouldn't you know it, one of those is torpedoes. You have torpedoes that do an arguably game-breaking amount of damage, and to add to their power, they're also very fast. You also have very good concealment, which should not be much of a surprise here. And you would do well to not try to get spotted in this ship, but like other Japanese destroyers, you actually do have very effective HE shell damage on your guns, and you have a full complement of 6 rather than the Udachi's somewhat awkward 5-gun arrangement. On the other hand, getting into a prolonged engagement with another destroyer is not what you want to do in general. Your other characteristics like your health pool, turret traverse, and reload speed mean that the longer the battle goes, the more it tends to go against you. Also, with unimpressive speed, it's very likely that any destroyer that can outgun you can also outrun you. And on a completely different note that I shall present without a segue, at least among your IJN peers, you do have the longest torpedo reload. So all in all, the Yukikaze is pretty much the same but different experience that you're already used to in Japanese destroyers. And if you're really into this type of gameplay, then you know who you are. I think she'll appeal most strongly to people who have trouble hitting with torpedoes already, because both the speed makes it a bit easier, and the damage means you actually don't need to hit all that many times in order to come away with a decent game. But if you already have the Asashio, there's not a lot of reasons you should need this one, and if you're perfectly comfortable in the Akatsuki without the premium bonus, this isn't going to really replace it as the best torpedo boat at Tier 6. And both existing Tier 6 Japanese torpedo boats have higher top-end potential, in my estimation. As we come to stats, we'll mostly be talking about this ship versus the other destroyers at the tier, in particular the Akatsuki and Asashio. So first, as usual, is survivability. This is a destroyer, so the most important thing here is going to be hit points. With 15,100, this is exactly what you'd expect from the Asashio, and it's within one good secondary hit of being average for the tier. You're likely to end up with somewhat less than this because of some of the attractive options that you're probably going to make when you set up your captain, and we'll get to that a little bit later. As far as your armor, 6mm on the superstructure, you've got about 15 on all of your hull, and then 20 on your turrets. If somebody's playing particularly aggressive in a light cruiser or a destroyer, you can bounce a couple of AP shells if you're lucky, but for the most part, they're going to shoot HE at you and you're going to take damage. With the Yukikaze, I'm sure some folks will be surprised to learn this, you do have guns, and you're pretty decent with them. The artillery in question here is 3 turrets with 2 127mm guns each. They range out to 10.4 kilometers and reload every 7.5 seconds. This is exactly the setup that you have on Akatsuki, though you do get a little bit more out of your HE. 21,500 is 350 damage more than your fellow IGN destroyers do. Why, I don't know. And to add to that, you're also getting 2% more fire chance, and since the damage here is only 50 less than you'd be doing with a Citadel hit using your AP, the smart money is pretty much on setting this to high explosive and never switching your shell choice unless you're truly desperate. Other than that, this 2200 damage is normal for Japanese destroyer AP. This makes you all around a better gunfighter than either of the other Japanese destroyers I've been talking about, but you do have very slow gun tracking, and this 7.5 second reload is pretty long. So just like other Japanese destroyers, firing your guns is a better idea if you know you'll be able to quickly disengage, either by ducking behind an island, into smoke, or because your target simply has so few hit points that it can't possibly survive 1 or 2 volleys. But the long reload means you're probably going to get worn down if you have to take too many shots, but you should shoot your guns if you need to, or if you know that you're totally screwed. When it comes to torpedoes, this is probably the most important and most unique part of this ship. You come with 2 quad launchers, which is nothing strange, but they have these torpedoes that deal upwards of 21,000 damage, easily the heaviest hitting torpedoes at tier 6 by about 3,000 damage. And that does mean that this ship hands out devastating strikes like participant ribbons in youth sports ball. In theory, this is somewhat balanced out by having a really long 104-second reload. For context, you have to get to ships like Kidd or Jervis to find worse torpedo reloads. Your advantage to damage is larger than this difference in reload though, so Yukikaze ends up with an overall torpedo damage over time that is a bit above Asashio's, but more than 15% lower than Akatsuki. Though I suspect the torpedo reload booster on Asashio more than makes up for this difference in any practical situation. The other balancing factor here is the 8 kilometer base range and high torpedo detectability. You can get these torpedoes comfortably to 9 kilometer range or slightly more, and you will probably want to do that, and with very high speed this means that the reaction time is actually only slightly worse than average, and certainly if they're sailing towards the torpedoes, it's even worse for them. Moving into maneuverability, unless you're in the Shiratsuyu, which I am very intentionally not talking about, you're not going to find a slower destroyer at this tier. And that should make the Ekizuki the only destroyer that you can face, other than that actually has a slower base speed. It's not the absolute worst news ever, since most destroyers are only maybe 2 or 3 knots faster, but like all Japanese DDs, other than maybe the Akatsuki, you're not very good at running away. This 640 turning circle is kind of a C- at the tier, and with only 2.7 seconds on its rudder shift, you're tied for the joint best here. When looking at concealment, you're right in the middle of the Asashio, which has 100 meters better stealth, and the Akatsuki, which has 100 worse. All of the Japanese destroyers are pretty sneaky, and it is very possible to get this number below 5, which naturally is totally not broken at all. But this is something that we're used to, so no surprises for concealment. Consumables. We'll almost skip this, but I will stop long enough to say that you have a standard repair party, and you have your standard 2 additional destroyer consumables. Those are your standard smoke generator and your standard speed boost. You also get the standard number of them, so overall, pretty standard. And with all that out of the way, we will jump into some gameplay. We're going to be on Crash Zone. I start the game off by staring a little bit at the team compositions here. It's taking a little bit longer than normal. because of the sad realization that there are as many as 4. Yes, 4 cruisers with radar on the enemy team. Probably 2. Well, definitely 2. But maybe as many as 4. In any case, I'll go ahead and put my commander up on the screen. This is your standard Tanaka torpedo build. We are going for the maximum amount of range and damage and torpedo reload and fastest torpedoes and all that good stuff. For the most part, this is probably what you're going to run if you want to run a ship like the Yukikaze. Second place, I will probably give to a build that looks something like this. The one and only reason why I can see why you'd really want to do that is to get a little bit more out of your survivability by getting access to twist and track. So then I'd at least know where the closest person is. There's only one destroyer on the enemy team, so we won't need to worry too much about that in this particular battle. In any case, we can see that there are 3 ships accounted for on this side of the spawn. We have another guy kind of coming in towards the middle. I'm looking out there at the Gneisenau and the Iowa, and I'm kind of picking and choosing which one of these I think I'm going to be able to get into range of safely and land some torpedoes on. Now, ideally, you see that Iowa is moving in the direction of the Gneisenau. The Gneisenau is not doing a ton of movement himself. So I kind of wait until I think maybe there'll be some overlap there in terms of where the Gneisenau might be and where the Iowa is going. Because if they bump into each other, then there's a good chance they'll probably bump into my torpedoes. Unfortunately, as it always is with firing torpedoes, as soon as you fire them, the Gneisenau starts to back up. Now he's moving forward. And we just barely get that torpedo there. Actually, we ended up landing 2. That gets us a nice 29,000 damage to start the game off. And we're still just kind of hanging out in the back here. You can see on my team, you know, the enemy's got the center and also the west. I'm taking the scenic route. This isn't the best place to be. It isn't the worst place to be either. If I can make a difference in terms of whittling down these targets, then that'd be good. Ordinarily in a destroyer, I would like to be in amongst those bases, but it looks like we've got plenty of cruisers out there. You never know which cruisers are going to have radar, particularly in this match, except in the case of the Baltimore and the Atlanta. They're always going to have radar, so you can't get too close to them unless you kind of know what the situation is. In the meantime, we land 2 more torpedoes, and wouldn't you know it, we're up to 70,000 damage. And you can see, this is basically, I mean, this is exactly what you expect to see here, right? We're kind of floating around on the outskirts. The enemy has allowed me to more or less work around their flank entirely because nobody's really paying attention to what's going on over here. That Baltimore is gonna have radar. His radar is pretty much exactly the same range as my torpedoes, and they're both just about as dangerous to one another as can possibly be. Now, for a second here, I'm thinking maybe this battleship is going to come around close, and if he turns in towards C, then I should be able to get my torpedoes on him. Kind of debating how I want to fire these. And I didn't quite get around far enough. Didn't quite get to where I wanted to in order to do this, so we punched the gas again. Of course, he was close enough that unless he immediately did something drastic, he was going to get hit by those. 2 more torpedoes land. As you can see, they're pretty fast, and they do a lot of damage. So we've got 6 hits, 87,000 damage, and 1 kill. Unfortunately, kind of the overall rub on the Japanese destroyers is a lot of times it doesn't feel like you should be poking about in the base quite as much as maybe some of the other destroyers. That tends to mean that you don't have as big of an impact as maybe a gunboat DD, just because you do want to make sure that you have at least a little room to get away. And about this time, I'm going to start thinking, you know, I need to go and get into B. I have a sneaking suspicion that there's a destroyer pretty close to me, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of like hanging out where I am. The enemy destroyer was also a Japanese destroyer, which means that I'm not actually in a bad position to get in a gunfight with them. Shiratsuyu is not, even though it's part of the Japanese gunboat line, not a very good gunboat. So I don't feel too bad about getting into a fight with him. Right now I'm just going to annoy him by shadowing him, hopefully drive him off, because if there's one thing that a Japanese destroyer doesn't like is being spotted. My C detectability with this current build is 4.6, and his appears to be slightly higher than that. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of teammates anywhere near me to take advantage of that, so he is going to get away, and hopefully he will, not come back. But in case he does, those torpedoes are going out for him, and they're more or less playing the edge of the island instead of being aimed at any particular thing. The white line is helpful, but it tells you a lot of things that aren't going to be true by the time they get there. We have managed to come back to a 3-3, which isn't too bad. Once I get this, we should start to get some of our points back, because obviously we are currently down by 21 points, which is about 7 ticks. And that Shiratsuyu appears to know that all too well. Now, as we're getting close to the Shiratsuyu, you can see that my allies are shooting at him. And my just sort of hanging out here is useful, but not as useful as it could be. I'm just going to pay attention to those torpedoes for just a second. For those who are going to ask, that's preset number 2. And it does mean that you don't get the benefits of the gun lock, if you want to use that. At this point, we cannot allow the Shiratsuyu to get the base. I believe his turrets were not perfectly aimed at me, but they're obviously close enough that he more or less starts shooting at me immediately. That's a good guess on his part, but not too hard since there's a a cruiser to his north, and obviously I'm not going to drive towards that thing. That's insane. Now we're taking a little bit more damage than I would like. Operating under the theory that smokescreen is an excellent torpedo magnet, I go ahead and put my super fast torpedoes out on the smokescreen. We're going to transfer our guns to the other side because I don't want to get any closer to the cruiser to my west. I think I might have enough time to get my guns to the other side, but I don't. And there, with one nicely placed shot, just with the front turret, we do manage to finish him off. I will say with that, I mean, that's kind of a good demonstration of both that Japanese destroyers do have pretty good HE damage and can be pretty good in a short duration fight, but the Yukikaze also does have pretty terrible turret traverse, so not a gunfighter. Japanese destroyers have decent guns, and I think too many people are a little bit too comfy with never shooting them ever at all. I am trying to stay in this cap because I do not want the points to accumulate anymore. Obviously you can see we're only 2 points ahead. Unfortunately, I've run out of room, so I need to start shooting at him. I might have been able to finish him off before his second volley, but obviously that's a little taste of what you don't want to do in terms of you don't want to get into prolonged gunfights with this thing, and you don't want to do it with the US cruiser for sure. But if I had a couple extra seconds, I probably have finished him off. We didn't really need to worry about that because our teammates came through for us and helped to finish off those last couple of ships. We end with a neat 101,000 damage and a pretty decent game that kind of shows you just the normal stuff you do in a Japanese destroyer. So, closing thoughts on Yukikaze. For those of you who are new here, this sort of gameplay is really not my favorite. In fact, I kind of find it pretty boring overall. The main draw to this ship is obviously the silly amount of damage that you can do with your torpedoes, at least on a per torpedo basis, and the fast torpedo speed. So that's kind of why I was saying earlier, that's why I think this is probably better for folks who are lucky to land any hits in a given game, rather than people who are really good at predicting, because Akatsuki is going to have so many more torpedoes that you get over the course of a game, and you can layer them a little bit better with the 3x3 arrangement. Asashio is quite a bit lower in terms of damage per torpedo versus the Yukikaze. Their reload speeds aren't actually that much different, but those reload boosters can really help you cheese the moments when you need extra torpedoes now. Overall, I don't have a lot to say about this because it's a Japanese destroyer. If this is your kind of gameplay, this is a perfectly acceptable ship. I would probably prefer the Asashio personally, but naturally the Yukikaze has a really great history. So this was a fun review to make, if for that reason alone. In any case, those are my thoughts on Yukikaze. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and as always, hope to see you on the next one.